Ignition sequence start. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. Liftoff. We have
Welcome to the Journal of Space Commerce podcast. I'm Tom Patton. On March 17th, the Aerospace Industries Association and PricewaterhouseCoopers released a white paper focused on the supply chain for the commercial space industry, and the findings may have been something of a wake-up call for the industry. According to the report, Strengthening America's Space Supply Chain, Built for Yesterday, Igniting Momentum for Tomorrow, the U.S. space industrial base has not kept pace with industry growth, and that poses risks to national security as well as civil and commercial space programs. My guests are here to talk about the report and how the commercial space industry can use it going forward. Steve Jordan Tomaszewski is VP of Space Systems at AIA, with prior roles at the Aerospace Corporation, advising senior Department of War executives on satellite architectures, budget programming, and space policy. He's also an Air Force Reserve Intelligence Officer assigned to the National Reconnaissance Office. Doug Anderson is a consulting solutions partner at PwC's Operations and Supply Chain Services practice and co-author of the report. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining me today.
Well, Tom, thank you so much for having us. And I would just like to mention that the Journal of Space Commerce is doing such a great job covering space supply chain issues. So it's an honor to be here.
Very happy to have you both. And I'm going to give a brief overview here because the report found that U.S. space object launches surpassed 3,400 in 2025, which was nearly 10 times the 2019 volume, while industry capacity has not kept pace, with many critical components supported by just 3 or fewer qualified domestic suppliers. So, Steve, I'll start with you. What was kind of the aha moment that convinced AIA that this supply chain report needed to happen now? Was there a data point or an anecdote that made this problem impossible to ignore?
Well, Tom, at the Aerospace Industries Association, we have the privilege of convening senior industry leaders together pretty frequently. And, it was not too long ago, I was talking with a CEO of a space company, and it was just hearing about some of the challenges of kind of purchasing satellites and integrating different components together. And it just was very difficult for that CEO to be able to actually get what he needed in a timely manner, which was really posing a challenge to their ambitious goals of, getting a new type of satellite in orbit. And the more we kept listening about this, it just seemed to be more of an industry-wide issue that, actually building launch vehicles and satellites, it gets really tricky, and there's certain kind of core messages that we just kept hearing from folks. So that's really why we did this report. We wanted to hear what the current challenges were kind of across satellite and launch vehicle manufacturing. And then we really wanted to partner with PricewaterhouseCoopers, who are really some of the industry's leading consultants and working with a lot of satellite and launch vehicle manufacturers. So we knew that they'd be able to help get us the best expertise and really to kind of capture some of the challenges, but then also make some recommendations to how to fix everything.
So, Doug, is this a problem that's unique to the space industry, or is it a symptom of broader industrial-based decline?
I think it's a bit of both, honestly. Like the underlying drivers, this aging infrastructure, aging workforce and workforce shortages, underinvestment, these are symptoms of a broader industrial hollowing out. But space has some unique compounding problems. You've got extremely low production volumes, highly specialized components with a lot of, very difficult requirements, and a government customer that's operated on these continuing resolutions in like 46 of the last 49 fiscal years. So that kind of budget whiplash, that doesn't exist in most industries. So it's kind of a broader disease with this particularly acute flare-up in space.
Now, the report found that a lot of critical components have three or fewer qualified domestic suppliers, as I mentioned in the intro. So I'll open this up to both of you. How to identify what components were the most at risk, and were any of those findings genuinely surprising?
Yeah, I mean the way we went about this, we kind of combined public data with a lot of direct interviews across a number of primes and a lot of their tier one and tier two suppliers, asking them where they're feeling the most pain, where they're having the most issues. And the common thread was components that are both technically complex and low volume makes them unattractive for suppliers to prioritize. So things like carbon fiber composites, space grade valves, the optical intersatellite links, and a surprising one was the post-processing shops. But in all of these cases, you've only got two or three qualified suppliers, qualified sources globally. And so what really also surprised us was just how fast some of this has deteriorated. Valve manufacturers in particular, they actually declined by 11% from 2010 to 2022, even as the space demand was surging. So the supply base is shrinking while the demand is growing.
What was kind of the first chink in the armor? Where did the supply chain issue break first?
Well, one of the things that I might point out is, we already talked a little bit about the increasing demand for satellites and for launch vehicles. So overall, that is a good problem to have. It means that space is being more and more useful in our everyday lives all around the world. And especially if we look for applications like using satellites for national security purposes, if we're looking at using satellites for exploration, for communications, and more of commercial applications, there is just more and more demand happening today. However, we don't see capacity and the manufacturing base able to keep up with that demand. It's just getting more and more strained. I don't think there's a single kind of point of failure here of just something that was the tipping point. It's just a lot of factors kind of working together for putting a lot of challenges and really straining the current capacity.
Yeah, Doug mentioned, go ahead, Doug. I'm sorry.
I was just going to point out, so agree with what Steve said, but maybe just point out one in particular that was a little surprising to us was on the electrical infrastructure. It's one that you don't immediately think about when you think of, space and satellites. But lead times for like switch gears and transformers and electrical infrastructure like that, you need that to power launch facilities, the launch pad test facilities, factories. Those things have stretched to over 130 weeks or more, is what we heard. And just a year or two ago, nothing had over a year lead time. So that's a pretty stunning deterioration in a short window. A lot of that probably driven by the AI data center boom. And when you're trying to buy these components for space programs in relatively small volumes, it's hard to compete against some of these larger buyers.
One of the things that you mentioned, Doug, a few moments ago was the workforce. And I'm thinking about, you have celebrities like Mike Rowe who are trying to get more and more people interested in doing things other than maybe going and getting a 4-year liberal arts degree and working as someone who works with their hands and builds things. Is there enough of that kind of workforce available to cover what it is that the space industry needs in its supply chain?
I would say most certainly not. A lot of that workforce is aging, is retiring, and a lot of that expertise is just simply not there, and we're not seeing it being replenished at a rate fast enough to keep up with the growing demand.
Steve, we've talked about qualified suppliers. What's a qualified supplier, and what makes them a qualified supplier, and how does a company become a qualified supplier?
So it really comes down to how difficult it can be to make some of these particular components that go on launch vehicles and satellites. So, compared to, going down to your local hardware store and picking up, a valve that is going to be used for your garden hose, if you want to have a specific valve that is able to work on a launch vehicle and operate in extreme cold temperatures to survive the vibration and the kind of acoustic profiles of a space launch, it's very difficult to do that. So, when we take a step back and look at, how do you get parts that are good enough to be used on spacecraft, there's certain escalatory elements here. You might go, and we have some examples of this with dollar values assigned in the report that I encourage folks to take a look at. But it can be pretty easy to get a $30 valve for a garden hose. But if you want to have a space qualified valve, there's instances where that might be $10,000, even maybe $1 million for a single valve. That's kind of a critical component there. And so when we're talking about those trusted suppliers, how do you make sure that all of your parts can qualify and kind of test appropriately to be used in a very harsh space environment? And there's different levels of doing that. But one of the big findings, I think, from this report is, we need to actively look at some of those specifications and see if those are still necessary for the volume of spacecraft that we're building today. A lot of the specifications or requirements, can be traced back to the Apollo era, and it's just the old way of doing things. Folks are comfortable with certain flight hardware because it's been proven over time, but that also makes it difficult to expand and grow the industrial base to bring new capacity in, where you have to meet very, very high standards to make something space grade.
The report identifies 9 specialized component categories that have capacity gaps. But so without giving away the full report, can you characterize for us what those categories have in common?
Yeah, I would say the common thread is they're all components that sit at the intersection of high technical complexity, low volume, and high qualification burden. And that combination, it just drives away new suppliers. It causes existing ones to question whether they should be in the business. One supplier that we interviewed walked away from their composite pressure vessel business. The work was consuming, over 30% of their engineering time and only generating low single-digit percentage of their revenue. So when you're looking at something like that and that trade-off, you can't blame them for making that business decision.
And I might just add, Tom, that so we're proud to kind of pull together this top 9 list of components, and what those really kind of fell into. There were parts of satellites that were kind of specific to satellites. There were parts of launch vehicles and kind of the propulsion systems that are a big part of that. But we also had a category of things, something that Doug mentioned before, ground-based electrical equipment. With the switch gears and transformers, which I do think was a big surprise to us. But as we're looking at solutions of how to actually scale up the industrial base at large, if we keep hitting these bottlenecks and long lead times for just getting these giant, think of them like big circuit breakers on the ground. You need those to build satellite factories. You need those to build launch pads for telemetry tracking control stations. So that kind of enabling infrastructure is one of the things that's kind of stopping the capacity for growing right now, even with all the increased demand.
Well, let's talk about that infrastructure for a moment, because a lot of those industrial facilities in aerospace now average about 26 years of age. So what does it actually look like on the factory floor when a supplier is running 1990s era facilities trying to meet the demand of the growing satellite constellations here in the mid 21st century?
Yeah, I would say, an industrial manufacturer with 26-year-old equipment, that looks like deferred maintenance on top of deferred maintenance, just compounding on itself. And it means, machine tools that struggle to hold their tolerances. It's manual processes that in other more modern factories would be automated. Even just the building systems themselves, like HVAC and power distribution we talked about, they weren't necessarily designed for the requirements of today, some of the clean room requirements or thermal vacuum requirements. And so you you can't just like slow down and fix this stuff. The demand keeps coming. And so they're running this equipment really hard. They're having, and that's even causing degradation. And then they're having a lot of unplanned downtime. And so it's just this compounding effect, and it's kind of a problem that eventually becomes a crisis.
I'm talking with Steve Jordan Tomaszewski and Doug Anderson about the recently released Space Supply Chain Report. When we come back, we'll dive into policy and potential solutions on the Journal of Space Commerce podcast.
You're listening to the Journal of Space Commerce podcast from Xterra Media. The Journal of Space Commerce is the only industry publication to offer in-depth coverage of the entire space commerce value chain, from the supply chain to satellite operations and terrestrial applications. If you're a decision maker or investor in the space commerce industry, or an executive who needs to know how space commerce touches your business, please consider becoming a paid subscriber. Of course, everyone is welcome. Your paid subscription will give you first access to premium articles and podcasts focused on the space value chain. From market analyses to regulatory developments and company spotlights, paid subscribers will find valuable data to help you make informed decisions. Just visit www.xterrajsc.com on Substack and help keep the Journal of Space Commerce the industry's only independent source for space commerce intelligence for business leaders.
Welcome back to the Journal of Space Commerce podcast. I'm Tom Patton. The Journal of Space Commerce podcast is available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Rumble, and many other multimedia platforms, as well as on Substack. Please subscribe so that you are notified when we post new podcasts and videos wherever you stream your multimedia content. Steve, you said in a recent webinar that you held introducing the report that there are no silver bullets for solving these issues. So what does silver buckshot look like? What's the portfolio of actions that actually are needed to move the needle?
Thanks, Tom. And I think that's a great question. So a couple of things that came out of this report were a number of recommendations of how do we grow the space supply chain? How do we scale it up? How do we fix some of these persistent issues? Let me maybe just highlight a couple. Number one, I think the best thing that could happen to grow the space supply chain is for a stable demand signal, especially from the US government about what they need to accomplish missions in space. If you look back the last several years, there are a number of just kind of wild swings of, a lot of interest and money going to space efforts and then scaling back. Even as we're recording this right now, we're in the third government shutdown of this fiscal year. And all of that, because the federal government is such a big part of the space industry overall, that inconsistent demand signal doesn't give businesses a lot of surety to actually make the investments necessary to kind of grow capacity. So that just consistent demand signal, I think, is right at the top of the list. Second, really increasing visibility of when these issues are happening, I think would benefit government and industry alike. So we're asking for things like having better channels to be able to surface early supply chain issues and making sure that those get flowed up to some of the major industry prime integrators and the government to really identify problems early on so you can actually take actions to fix them. And then when we're looking at the different components, the question becomes, how do you fix components if typically in especially procurement of satellites, you're really looking at a single satellite or a satellite constellation, but the conversation might need to shift to seeing what we could do to actually work together between government and industry, but having a focus on these specific components that keep having problems. We talked a little bit already about testing. Testing is a huge part of this. It's also going to have to be kind of some public-private partnerships to be able to fix that. We need more test facilities so you can make sure that all of the parts are space qualified, and then also find ways to quickly onboard new suppliers and take advantage of some of that new innovative manufacturing capabilities happening.
Doug, anything to add?
I think that I agree with all the stuff that Steve said. One additional area is maybe financial incentives that are targeted, like contracts, subsidies, or even like small business administration financing pathways to bring some new suppliers into some of those most fragile areas. So yeah, maybe just some of those financial incentives.
So then what specific policy or regulatory changes, whether they be at the FAA or at NASA or DoD or even in Congress, might have the most immediate impact on supply chain resilience? And which ones are politically realistic right now?
Well, in terms of politically realistic, I think this is why this is a really exciting topic this year, and why I think this report will hopefully be a good guide to helping to try to fix some of these issues. Just as an example, with the latest executive order that came out about space superiority, it mentioned supply chain in the industrial base 6 different times in that executive order. There is White House attention to want to grow the industrial base, wanting to do everything from increasing, attracting investors, private investors, looking at certain things like foreign direct investment into our domestic manufacturing capabilities. So I think there's a lot of energy behind this right now. So when you're looking at modernizing different regulations, it has to be really challenging some of the status quo that might be out there for a while. It's looking at what not only the different regulators are doing, what policies or kind of requirements are in place for the government procurement teams. When they're going out there to buy a new type of satellite, making sure that they're not over engineering or having too stringent of requirements, which from what might be needed for the mission. So I think it's challenging at that place. And then, the role of Congress is really important here. When we're looking at having that stable demand signal and actually consistent funding from the federal government, Congress is actually driving, how we're doing a lot of those funding profiles. So I think it's going to take a combination of all of the above, of modernizing regulations, challenging requirements and specifications, and then finding new ways to have kind of that consistent and stable funding from Congress.
I'd add too, like one maybe immediate thing we could do is expand some DPAS, the Defense Priorities and Allocation System that already exists. Just broaden it so that some of the commercial space programs can use it to jump the queue on some of those long lead items that we were talking about earlier, like the electrical equipment.
The report calls for expanding the supplier base, which is what we were kind of just talking about. But given how long aerospace qualification takes, how do we realistically bring in enough new suppliers fast enough to matter for programs launching in the next 3 to 5 years?
I would say we should focus on some of the commercial alternatives first, and not rely on the net new suppliers. So like Steve was just talking about, designing satellites to utilize some of the commercial alternatives that are out there, or slightly modified commercial equipment that would, so they're using commercially available components. That would be a way to bring in new suppliers more rapidly, existing suppliers. You can adapt some of the folks who are making things like hyperbaric chambers or naval equipment or other high reliability industries, so you can shorten that qualification clock significantly. One thing we found was the Defense Innovation Unit. They're already moving in this direction with the commercial solutions opening for space supply chain. And then for the truly space specific components, you can compress timelines through government-funded qualification grants, and then having like good published guidance from NASA and the Pentagon. And then again, like Steve was saying, industry-led reviews to eliminate requirements that are either obsolete or they're not essential to the actual mission at hand. So those things won't necessarily close the gap entirely, but I think it'll move the needle meaningfully.
Yeah, the flip side of that coin is the speed at which the technology changes. And you're looking at long lead times on getting people qualified and the various components that need to go into spacecraft. And yet by the time somebody is qualified to build whatever widget is they're building, that widget may be obsolete. Is there an answer to that question? I'm getting
Yeah,
no.
that's a tough one. It really is. Those technology, the technology clock speed, you're right, especially in some of the electronic components, can be faster than it is for, the development and qualification cycles. So, yeah, again, no silver bullet there.
But I do think it goes back to what we've already been talking about from the testing perspective, right? So just having more capacity and being able to test and qualify parts is a big part of that solution. Instead of having to wait, 1 year, 2 year, maybe even longer sometimes for kind of a full testing sequence to give the confidence needed to put something into space. If you're having some of those new technologies come on the market, if they're able to get tested quickly at scale to give enough kind of confidence in the new parts, that's how you get the most rapid and the tip of the spear technologies integrated into the architectures.
Just a couple of things more, and we could probably stretch this out to 2 hours if we wanted to be honest about it. But I wanted to talk about the possible effect of NASA's recent announcement of the major changes that have been made in the Artemis and LCD programs. Is there any confidence that those will last longer than the current administration? And how are the supply chain people going to react to those changes?
Well, I think the good news, Tom, is if you look at something like the Artemis program, it has lasted. This is the third administration that it's lasted through. So there's a lot of consistency there and a very bold vision. But for kind of that bigger question of new architectural changes, what impact does that have on the supply chain? The challenge is if there are these bold new initiatives that for NASA space exploration, for example, that are out there, industry is ready to meet the challenge, but they have to know where the funding is going to be, what the architecture is going to be as early as possible. I think there's some good examples out there where there's some government offices that have identified technology roadmaps of this is not only what we have currently funded, but this is where we want to develop technologies in the next several years. Every indicator like that is a good is good for industry to be able to understand what's happening in the future, so they can make their own internal investments or just kind of prepare for that next wave of demand. The thing that we just keep hearing from our AIA member companies is the more surety that especially the U.S. government can give about the future of their plans for space exploration and national security space, that gives them the confidence they need to make those strategic investments and to grow capacity.
Let's talk about investments for just a minute, Doug, because from a capital markets perspective, is the private equity moving into the space supply chain picks and shovels companies fast enough to solve this? Or does that qualification and long sales cycle dynamic make that unattractive for most PE timelines?
Yeah, we do see PE moving into, like you said, some of the picks and shovels supply bases, but not nearly fast enough. And the structural reasons for that are certainly understandable. PE will typically target, let's say, a 3 to 7 year return horizon. And, a space supply chain investment requires long qualification cycles. We were just talking about that unpredictable government demand, and, capital intensive physical assets. So that profile doesn't fit most PE company mandates. Um, and I would say the investment that we see has been heavily concentrated at the prime level. A handful of launch companies and satellite companies with these multi-billion-dollar valuations. But then the upstream supplier ecosystem is kind of undercapitalized. So we need the government to either, de-risk that payback window a bit for PE, or we need a longer time frame, for PE to realize that investment at scale. So, yeah, we're just not seeing enough investment fast enough from PE.
Couple of just kind of wrap up questions, because if Washington and the industry together don't take any deliberate action in the next 18 months, what does the space supply chain look like in 2028? So paint a downside scenario for me.
Well, something that could realistically be happening here is that a country like China could beat us back to the moon and putting people on the moon, right? So it's the downside of not making a lot of these investments is slips to programs, having schedule delays. Delayed capacity from space services that support the warfighter around the world. So there are some real consequences with this. So it's one of these things, though. I think there's an opportunity right now, if we do take space supply chain seriously, figure out ways between government and industry to kind of scale up capacity. It's going to be paying a lot of dividends here. And I think at the end of the day, when we're looking at some of these kind of creative solutions of how you fix this, things like having public-private partnerships for testing, looking at better ways to have visibility of issues, having discussions of things like, is it appropriate to have some sort of a national stockpile for some of these components? I think those conversations, the more things that we can get funded quickly is going to help us really shore up a lot of those potential downsides.
And then on the flip side of that, then, what does success look like in 5 years? Are there 2 or 3 key performance indicators that would tell you that the U.S. space supply chain is actually healthy and scalable?
Yeah, a couple of indicators that we can monitor to see that the space supply chain is healthy and stable. I think the first one is, an average qualified supplier count per these critical component categories. We talked about there only being 2 or 3 qualified suppliers for some of these, of the 9 critical component categories. Well, what if we saw that move up to 3 or 5 or more for each of those, right? That would be a really strong indicator that the health is improving. The other one is lead time reduction. We talked about the electrical infrastructure being at 130 weeks or more. Let's get that back down to under 52 weeks. And it's not just electrical components and infrastructure. We heard that long lead time complaint across all the categories. So those are 2 good KPIs. I think another one that's maybe a little bit harder to measure, but something to keep in mind too, is just supplier bid participation rates. Are more companies bidding on space work and these components or fewer? Right now, a lot of suppliers are opting out. So we need to reverse that trend. And that would be a good leading indicator that the economics of participating in the space market are improving. So I'm optimistic for the future. These are a couple of the KPIs that I'd be watching.
And Tom, I might just add that I'd love to have the 9 critical components that we identified as part of the study not be on the list if we did this again 5 years from now, right? So, I think this gives us, great opportunities that if we can address some of these issues that are kind of plaguing the space supply chain right now, I'd love to have a blank list in a couple of years from now.
Gentlemen, we are out of time, but it's been a fascinating conversation. As I said, we could probably go on for at least another hour talking about this issue, but it's going to be one that is certainly going to affect a lot of what it is that we do over the course of the next several years. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Tom. It was a pleasure to be here and talking with you.
Thanks, Tom.
Steve Jordan Tomaszewski is VP of Space Systems at AIA, and Doug Anderson is a consulting solutions partner at PricewaterhouseCoopers Operations and Supply Chain Service Practice. Gentlemen, thank you again for joining me on the Journal of Space Commerce podcast. And thank all of you for joining me today. I'm Tom Patton. We'll see you next time.
The Journal of Space Commerce podcast is a production of Xterra Media. The executive producers are Mike Turner and Tom Patton, with production assistance from Debbie Turner. You can subscribe to the audio version of the podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Audible, and many other popular podcasting platforms. Be sure to click subscribe so that you don't miss any of our podcasts or any of our other videos. The Journal of Space Commerce is the only industry publication systematically covering the entire space commerce value chain, from the supply chain to satellite operations and terrestrial applications. If you're a decision maker or investor in the space commerce industry, or an executive who needs to know how space commerce touches your business, please consider becoming a paid subscriber. Of course, everyone is welcome. Your paid subscription will give you first access to premium articles and podcasts focused on the space value chain. From market analyses to regulatory developments and company spotlights, paid subscribers will find valuable data to help you make informed decisions. Just visit www.xterrajsc.com on Substack and help keep the Journal of Space Commerce the industry's only independent source for space commerce intelligence for business leaders.